Hello.
Nope, muted still. Hello.
Ars Technica is saying you can run Starfield on a Steam Deck, but you shouldn't. It's too slow. Oh, did we want to begin? Is there anything we wanted to talk about? The notes are. No, nope. Xander put a thing.
I put a thing. Yeah, the same thing that I've had the previous couple times. So I think I have some thoughts, and then let's talk about it again next meeting. But it'll give folks a chance to kind of process like what I've, kind of landed on, I guess, for thoughts. I see everyone's got the doc open, so I'm not gonna screen share. So I guess where I'm at the moment is, the last time that I had the chance to bring this up at a meeting, we kind of ended on let's prioritize the motivation points to understand a little bit better the scope. And going through those, I think what I was able to like distill it into is the initial ask that looks like it drove this isn't really so much like it kind of started with disable audit for a given constraint, but I think when you look at the where that issue went and where the doc went and stuff, the initial P0 ask is disable a specific enforcement point for a specific constraint.
Sorry,
And
just like as an approach thing here, are we? Because I tend not to like the individual ask. Like I get that there's like some user need there, right?
Mhm.
And really there's like a very specific proposal that meets that need. But to be put it frankly, am very much against just like directly implementing based off of user asks because you wind up with like an incoherent whole.
Oh,
So
right. If we were to do that, we would be going with option three, which I don't think is the right
gotcha.
path forward. Um, I think, yeah, like distilling the like looking at where the user ask was coming from, I think we see, disable a specific enforcement point for a specific constraint. And then when you zoom out from that, you get to different enforcement points being able to take different actions. You get that further customization. And so I think I alluded to this last time, like where that kind of leaves us is like addressing the P0 that customer ask, not just directly, but zooming out a little bit from that. I think option two on this doc, which is the exclusion, does a great job of that. And then I think we talked about option four last time too, which is multi-action, which addresses the user need of, that the addresses the full scope of what this doc is trying to do at the expense of being much more complicated to implement and a much more like robust thing. And I think we could maybe use some experience tuning on option four, but like from where I'm looking at it right now, the layout of like option one, three, and five should be just completely disregarded. And I think it is left up to like as a group, do we want to invest the time to do the robust, potentially complicated solution, or the scale back solution that solves the problem? And I anticipate differing opinions across the panel here. But I highlighted option two and option four in green. I think I'd like to go in and add some additional examples for each of these. And I resolved some of the comments on the doc, and actually let me just drop a link to it real quick. Oh, it's in the meeting notes. I copied the doc to the Google Drive location because I didn't have permissions on the old one. And so on the old one, I have a proposed change on the top of the doc that says redirect to this one. And I copied this one with the full comment history and everything to the drive. Yeah. So yes, before I want everyone to have a chance to look at this and have some thoughts, and then we can like talk more in detail about it again next week too. But yeah.
I think there's another P0 here that it needs to project onto validating admission policy.
Okay.
Like, what does project mean? I'm being like kind of purposefully loose there, but it should be very readily translatable into, okay, at least this chunk of config can generate a validating admission policy, and we can readily predict how that will work, right? And maybe an easier way to explain it would to give like an anti-pattern. Like if you coupled action with match criteria, for instance, that would probably not project cleanly onto validating admission policy. Because validating admission policy, some of our match criteria are things like match kind, which validating admission policy doesn't support, right? So we're going to need to use cell match conditions to kind of like polyfill those in, which those will then go into a policy definition object, right? And whereas in validating admission policy, the action to take and is in the binding, and that's alongside the default VAP match criteria. So there may be no way to express, hey, if kind is pod, reject, or if kind is deployment, reject, if kind is pod, allow, or whatever it is, onto validating admission policy. Because there's no way really to write those primitives, at least not immediately that I could see. So I don't know if that made sense to you, but that's
it gave me some ammunition to go look at things because I haven't really spent much time with validating admission policy aside from being on the release team and like shepherding the KEP when it was coming through, but not actually looking at how it works.
gotcha. Yeah. So yeah, the best I could do is an example like that where I know projection is violated, right? Just because there could be like a number of ways to do something that does readily kind of translate.
Sertaj, Rita, Jay, to any of you have thoughts?
Yeah, I agree with Max that it also needs to work with web. I think that's what we need to consider, and then maybe we need a new option 6 or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
I think that what the issue was with 4 and 5 was this was just way too complicated for like the users to understand. I think that was the takeaway from the last time we spoke about.
Oh, really? I thought 4 wasn't so bad. What was the sticking point from a user understanding perspective for 4?
I don't remember now, but I remember when last time we spoke about this, I don't think we were happy with the just general UX with 4 and 5. That's why we punted it. So like, hey, we need to come up with a better UX so it's easy to understand. I don't remember what was the specific issue. I think it was just like in 4, like the enforcement points. I remember that was like a sort of kind of complicated.
Like, what are the possible enforcement points?
Yeah, like what can users put in? I don't know if you had. Let me see if I have any comments on this one. I don't see it. Yeah, I think what are the possible enforcement? Yeah, what are the possible actions, enforcement points, and excluded enforcement points?
Yeah, I mean, some of that is just necessary, right? Like, we need to have some sort of notion of an enforcement point if users want to do something like, hey, audit takes a different action than webhook, because honestly, that's the notion they're trying to express, right? And implicit in that is, okay, there's a thing called audit or whatever we want to call it, and there's a thing called webhook, and there's a thing called gator, right? And so, yeah, there's a user intent. They need some language to express that intent.
Right. I think that like how the actions and enforcement points sort of interact is kind of confusing because like the actions are like pops up, deny, and logs in the examples. Like how is deny and a log different actions? But isn't like deny an enforcement point like in terms of like validating that book? That's sort of that's the confusion I think on my side at least.
Oh, yeah, I would never call deny an enforcement point, right? Because it is an action that is taken by the webhook, right? Like the enforcement point is the thing that does a thing, and the action is the thing that it does.
Yeah. So I think we just need to clarify maybe like hey, what are the possible actions? What are the possible enforcement points and what each of them does it? Like how do they like interact with each other? And so that kind of makes sense from that. So like for example, does I don't know, action, deny, and the Terraform validator make sense? I don't know. Or
Yeah.
action pops up and Terraform validator. like how do we define those things, and how does a user sort of make sense without actually like digging deep down into like the code, or like to understand it. Like, so that does the YAML basically tell the story in this case?
Yeah, and some of that too, I think there needs to be some amount of delegation here, right? Like, I don't know if you want to presume to know every action that every enforcement point can take.
Right.
Yeah, so, but on the other hand, some level of standardization, right? So that users have like some reasonable expectation that, okay, this sort of thing will generally work. Like, do your default reject action, right? Kind of makes sense, right?
I mean, can we keep the scope small and then just target the ones that are provided by the gatekeeper? Like, so not like Terraform validators of the world. And if you want to extend it, we could, but just keep it like small for starting.
I mean, so right now, I mean, yeah. So the question is like, what are we even doing right now, right? And if I remember right, enforcement action is an unbounded list, right? So we're already kind of in that world. I think for practical purposes, enforcement action is right now pretty limited. Like, I'm not aware of anyone having any kind of like special actions.
Yeah, I don't know if anybody's actually using it. That's sort of my point. Like, let's just keep it scoped, maybe.
Well, people are using enforcement action, but you're
No, as
saying
in like the undefined enforcement action.
Yeah, I'm not sure.
I think we added a flag specifically to enable that behavior. So by default, I think it's just scoped to deny, dry run, and warning, I think.
Well, that, as far as gatekeeper validation is concerned.
Right. But do we know if anybody else is using this in other places, like with unbounded enforcement action?
I'm not aware of any yet. However, if we add in some way to support PubSub, and this is a K8s backwards compatibility thing, right? If you have an enum, technically you cannot add a new entry to that enum, because then you can't keep that state when you revert. There was something about enums, because I might be misremembering that, because you could certainly add fields, right? And reverting doesn't cause issues there. Anyway, the reality of, if we have enforcement action, right, and we have some way to support PubSub, older versions of Gatekeeper wouldn't be able to accept that constraint, right? It would reject it. I'm not sure what the answer to that would be for like the PubSub person, right? Or for Gatekeeper, right? What do you do if you receive an enforcement action you don't recognize? But probably
you mean if PubSub were to be an action?
Well, yeah. I mean, isn't that the plan, that we want to allow people to publish violations if they want to?
I mean, we have that today.
Audit violations, but I'm talking about like webhook stuff, like reject
I see.
and yeah.
So this is similar to like log denies, but as a webhook.
Yeah, like basically it's meeting that user ask that they tend to try to want to fill with Prometheus metrics. I want to know what's getting rejected, right? And Prometheus metrics are the wrong way to do this, because that's infinitely the infinite cardinality. we have logs, right? Like log denies, though the ask still persists, right? So logs aren't like a acceptable backend for some users. So pub/sub could be another option for that.
But I'm not following. Why do we need an action for pub/sub?
Well, which pub/sub queue do you want to send it to? Right? And do you want to send all violations or only certain violations?
But I thought we were going to do that in the CRD.
Which CRD?
So like in config map today or in the future, if there's a pub/sub CRD.
Oh, well, that's configuring the actual connection, right? Like authentication, which address, all that kind of stuff. But
Right.
once you have a connection, like which established connection do you want to pipe the violation to, right? If you have like certain policies that are maintained by your compliance department and certain policies that are maintained by your engineering standards department or whatever, you may want to pre-sort the notifications, right? Or if you have like dry run policies, you may not want to push those violations at all, right?
So like basically selecting within the violations. So
Yeah,
like,
oh, good.
So the example in the thing is super bad violations goes to the mypubsub.com.
Yeah. Like basically, I think people will want to be able to control on a per constraint basis whether a violation gets pub/subbed and where it gets pub/subbed.
I mean, can we like start with like sending everything to one pub/sub for starters, and then we can come around to this one maybe?
Kind of. The reason
we haven't even started that the initial work, but this makes it like too complicated, I think.
The problem with this is backwards compatibility, right? As far as like implementing the functionality, sure. But when we're talking about the API design, you kind of need to design the API to have enough scalability to meet anticipated use cases. Otherwise, you need to break backwards compatibility or do some other like shim to add it in later. And how that matters here is if we decided we just wanted to switch turn on pub/sub or not, right? That could be very simply like just add a string called pub/sub, right? And it's the same as deny, dry run, warn, right? And now pub/sub. But if later on we decide, okay, pub/sub, but to this queue, right? Then that string is insufficient, right? Because there's not enough information there. We just know pub/sub. We don't know to where. So that implies that enforcement action might be something more than a simple string.
I mean, can we like slice it afterwards? So like say today we do the audit violations to a pub/sub, right? Say we wanted to slice it later and then like send a small chunk of it to somewhere else. We can still define it afterwards. We only send it to one place today, but then like in the future, say we added this enforcement action, we could just say, hey, based on whatever this selector is, send it to here.
Based on whatever, so like add a secondary field.
Yeah, like in here in the super bad violations or something like that. Like.
But now, so what we've done then is one, we've complicated our object, right? Because now the action and the configuration for how to take that action live on different places of the object. And if we do have extensible enforcement actions, then there's no way to really have complex extended enforcement actions because it would require expanding the constraint schema, right? And there's no place to do that. So I mean,
my point here is that if you were to like expecting like this solution to like wait for like the pub sub and like the validating webhook pub sub and like the logs, that sort of stuff, that is the scope is just so large. We need to start somewhere. Like
the point is not to have all the functionality be implemented. The point is when you design a protocol, the protocol needs to leave space to implement the functionality.
Right, I agree with that. Yeah, right. But I think what we need to do is like basically figure out like what can we do right now to support this scenario? Like what are the possible like enforcement actions, enforcement points, that sort of stuff. What's possible today? And then in the future, like maybe have like a future work doc or something like that. And then hey, this is how we can extend it.
And the important bit there is that using a straight string for an enforcement action is not extensible, right? That's kind of my point. Is that if we're going to change some fundamentals of how stuff works here, right? Because this will not be trivial, right? This migration to change how match and enforcement action and all that works. We only want to take that pain once if we can, right? And so we should learn from our mistakes. And even though it's like another colon, right, and another indentation, not just use a simple string to specify enforcement actions. We should allow for some more data-rich stuff.
Yeah, I agree. So like it's very specifically defined ones instead of like, hey, define whatever you want. Sort of way.
Yeah, and we could even use this for like logging, right? Like instead of log denies as a flag, we could have a log denies enforcement action.
Right. I think this one already has the logs. I think that's what's kind of making this complicated. So maybe as a like a Xander, maybe as a next step, maybe let's look at it in a more simplified way, like what's possible today, like, and then maybe have like another section for like, hey, this is how we can extend it in the future with logs and like pops up, that sort of stuff.
Yeah, I mean, what
flesh out the examples a little bit.
What do we want to do, and what information will we need to pass through in order to do that? Both like, will the user need to give us, and will we need to give other systems? And what data density do we need, right? Like what, in terms of like how we structure our protocol, how do we do that in a way that is amenable to adding that information? I know it's like a lot of like big words, unfortunately. Like we could think about it very concretely with something like PubSub, but then it gets into the question of, well, why are we trying to like design the world? Or we could think about it abstractly in terms of like the information science bit, data density, and not losing information due to like conciseness and blah blah blah. But it's kind of the same discussion either way. Just pick your reason why it's painful.
Cool. I'll continue to update the examples on this and continue to work on this doc, and I'll post a little more async stuff this next week in Slack. I had intended to work on this a little bit more async before the meeting, and then I got sick for a week, and then I had a bunch of work stuff for a week. So I am circling back now, and I will I will post in Slack as I make updates to this so that going into the next meeting, we have kind of a kickoff point.
Cool. Thank you. Sir, anything more for this in this meeting, or did we want to declare that horse thoroughly?
Yeah, then let's make sure to consider the WAP scenarios too. Make sure that we can like map it in the future.
Yeah.
Just a quick note, Xander. I took some bad notes in the meeting notes, so if you need something to refresh your memory when you come back to this.
Looks good to me.
And I think the recordings go to YouTube now. Yeah,
Glad they fixed that. I do like having the recordings available.
Oh, here, by the way, here is when I was talking about enums. Here's the K8s backwards compatibility guidelines. It talks about enums and adding new fields. Basically, I'm trying to like read and talk, but I think it's saying there needs to be failure behavior, reasonable failure behavior for unrecognized values.
Is Frobber a thing, or is that just like made up?
What's this?
Is Frobber a thing, or is that made up?
I'm hoping that's made up. It handles all your foos. Not the bars, though. That'll happen in 2028. They're working on it.
In a dictionary, frob is to manipulate in some ill-defined way, to tweak or mess about with.
Huh. From the MIT Tech Model Railroad Club. So it's nerd slang.
Yeah. Well, anything else on the agenda? Looks like no. Are we okay to give the time back?
Sounds good. Thank you all.
Yeah.
Thank you.
It's good to see everyone.